Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back for our first after-lunch session. And this is with Dr. Alwyn D'Souza, Why Participate in Clinical Trials? It's Not About Being a Guinea Pig. Alwyn has kindly said you're welcome to ask questions during the presentation, and we'll do a 10-minute warning when we're getting close towards the end. Dr. Alwyn D'Souza is the Program Director of the Transplant and Cellular Therapy Unit at Wellington Blood and Cancer Centre, Te Whatu Ora, Capital Coast in Hutt Valley. He graduated from Otago School of Medicine in 1993. He did the majority of his postgraduate training in Wellington before completing his training in Melbourne at the Royal Melbourne Hospital and the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre. He has worked at Wellington Hospital as a consultant since 2006. His areas of special interest are bone marrow transplantation and lymphomas. He also has an interest in medical education and has previously been the chair of the New Zealand Joint Training Committee in Haematology. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. That might be premature because you haven't heard the talk yet. I don't have too many slides actually, and so there'll be plenty of time for questions, so feel free to ask any questions as we go. This, in some ways, is quite a dry talk, but it's also quite an important talk because clinical trials are really important because it is how we learn how to advance medical treatment. So they're very important in medicine, and I would like them to be of higher importance in New Zealand as well. I'm not quite sure why they asked me to do this talk though, because I've got several colleagues who run our research unit, and I'm involved in that, but I'm not actually one of the head ones. But anyway, you've got me today. Actually, just before we start, how many of you have participated in clinical trials here? Okay, so a reasonable amount. Good. Oh, well, that's really good. Hopefully the experience was positive, but we'll talk about positives and negatives in this. Okay, so why should we think about participating in clinical trials? What are they? I thought we'd talk about how trials are run, so you understand the process and some of the language that we use, which helps you understand why the trial is set up the way it is. What are the difference in the different phases of trials? So you've probably heard about people talk about phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3 trials. What are those differences, and how do we approach looking at the treatments in those trials differently? Why might you as a patient want to participate in a clinical trial? And why do we as doctors want our patients to participate in clinical trials? I think it is that one. So clinical trials, why are they performed? So they're performed to test new treatment strategies of some type. Now that may be a drug treatment, it may be radiotherapy, it may be a different way of doing something, but it's testing a hypothesis that this may be of benefit in a particular condition. So the trials are done to determine the effect of a treatment. If we know what the treatment effect is, it's not ethical to run a clinical trial because then we've already answered the question. So a trial has to be asking a specific question that's not known. Now, sometimes the effect of a drug may be sort of known if it's in the same class as another drug, but it may not be known for that particular drug. So sometimes we'll have an idea that we know that it's going to be similar, but we don't know that for certain until the trial is done. So trials can only be done if we don't know what the outcome is going to be, and that's quite important because while we think a drug might be good, it might not pan out that way, or a drug might be better than we expect, or we might see unexpected problems with the drug. So we only learn about these things from doing clinical trials. Trials might compare a treatment with what is standard of care for that condition, or they might be not comparing it to another drug, but using it in an earlier phase trial where the patient may not have any other treatment options available to them. So it gives them another potential line of therapy that they wouldn't otherwise be able to get. So we have different phases of clinical trials, and they are designed in a certain way to answer specific questions about a new treatment. The first phase is called phase 1 trials. Now these are human trials, so just bear in mind before a drug gets anywhere near a human, it has to be tested in the laboratory, and usually it'll have to be tested on animal models to see whether the concept is correct or not. Now, animals' bodies don't behave the same way as us, and so even though it might do one thing in one type of animal, it may not be the same in humans. So they have to go through a process, because if it turns out that there are unwanted safety issues in the laboratory or in animal models, that drug is unlikely to get anywhere near a human. So those are quite important steps before you've even got to a phase 1 trial. Often you'll see in the news, they'll be reporting some new thing in the laboratory and it's years off getting into humans. So just have to be careful when you see things on the news. Sometimes they're reporting things way before we're going to see any true benefit from that. Phase 1 trials are the first stage of testing safety of a drug. So the goals of a phase 1 trial are to test safety, and along the way we might also get an idea about how effective the drug is. But it's first of all designed to test safety. And so what happens is small numbers of people are enrolled at each stage, and often different doses of the drug will be tested. And they start off on the smallest, safest dose and gradually escalate it up to higher doses. And the trials are designed in a way that there are safety monitoring. So if you're on the first stage, no one can be entered on the next level of treatment until all of that data is reviewed and it's felt to be safe. If there are problems, then the drug will pause at the lower dose. They'll work out, is this manageable, or actually is this drug going to be canned? So they're designed in a specific way to test safety. By their nature, only small numbers of patients are entered on a phase 1 trial. That's the most common place where you'll start to see new drugs coming in, because before a new drug can be tested against the standard of care, it's got to go through a safety assessment. And so often these trials won't be comparing to another drug, they'll be where the drug is first starting. And the only patients you can really enroll on phase 1 trials are usually when they don't have any other treatment options, because if they've got another treatment option, we're going to recommend that ahead of a phase 1 trial, because we know all about the safety of that treatment and the effectiveness of that treatment. So phase 1 trials are usually very new drugs. They've got a lot more monitoring involved because we don't know very much about the drug at that point. So there's a lot of safety assessments. There's often a lot more blood tests to work out the pharmacology of the drug, and to make sure we know what it's doing in humans compared to, say, animals. So there's a lot more assessments, and it means also if you're enrolling in a phase 1 trial, you will end up having a lot more hospital visits because of all those safety things that need to be addressed. Okay, so then moving on to phase 2 trials. If a drug gets through a phase 1 trial and there's no safety concerns or no significant safety concerns about it, it then moves on to a phase 2 trial. And this is the same concept, but you're enrolling greater numbers of patients, and it's where we really start to get a better idea about effectiveness of a drug, because you're getting more patients on the trials. So if we're seeing an effect, you get a much better idea about how much of that the effect is. If a drug then passes through those the phase 2 trial and there's no issues and it seems to be doing what we think it's doing, it then goes on to a phase 3 trial, and these are much larger trials then. Double-blind study. So this is, I think actually, so we use certain terms in trials. One is called a double-blind or blinded trial. What that actually means is that the doctors and the patients don't know what the patient is getting. They might be getting the trial drug, or they might be getting a standard of care. Often if it's standard of care, if there's an additional drug in a regimen, they'll give a placebo or a fake drug as part of the standard of care. So we can't just say, well, he's only getting 3 drugs today, so they're on standard of care. She's getting 4 drugs, she must be on the new drug. So they try and make it so we don't know, because that's important, because then it helps eliminate some of the biases people have, because sometimes when we do assessments, if you think someone's on a new treatment, you want that treatment to work, and so you might, how you interpret that might be a bit more lenient than someone who's on a standard of care drug. So blinded trials are how we try and eliminate some of the potential biases we get in trials. So I think the funniest blinded trial I've seen was a graft versus host disease trial, where people were getting treatment for something called skin graft versus host disease, and they had dermatologists assessing people's skin, but they're called the blinded assessor. And it's like, how do you assess skin when you're blind? Anyway, so phase 3 trials are larger, much more patients involved, and they're usually comparing head to head with what is the current standard of care for that particular condition. When a trial is conducted, to do it properly, there's a whole lot of statistical calculations that need to go into working out how many patients need to go on each arm to demonstrate an effect. We have to try and predict what we think the effect will be to work out how many patients are going to go on there. So there's a whole lot of statistics that are way above my head. Probably my son could do that, but I can't. But that's how we work out how many patients need to be on the trial. So often we need to make an estimate about how much of an effect the drug is going to have, because if we think it's going to have a large effect, you don't need as many people. If it's only a very small effect, you need much greater numbers of patients. So say, for instance, some of the cardiology drugs that are used, they had thousands of people on each arm because they're looking for small effects across a population of people who lots of people have the condition. Many blood disorders are much more uncommon or rare, but the effect that we're after may be quite substantial, and so you may not need as many people on the trials to demonstrate a benefit. So, you know, I said this joke to was one of the patients that I was talking to at lunchtime was talking about her husband who went in to have surgery at a small hospital, in a rural hospital, and her husband said to the surgeon, "Do I really have to have this operation this afternoon, or can I just fly back to Christchurch and have it tomorrow?" And she said, "You can't say that. Yes, it tells them that you don't trust them." I went, "It's a fair enough question to ask." Okay, so the ethics of trial. So there are a lot of ethics that we need to consider when running a clinical trial. We know that if we don't have proper safety checks in place, independent safety checks, that bad things can happen. And that's been seen through many decades before systems like ethics committees were set up, where people ran unethical trials, and they may not have told patients they were in a trial. They might have done things which, when there was a treatment available to the patient, and the medical history unfortunately is littered with a number of very bad incidences. There are trials in the States about observing the natural history of syphilis. We had the issue in the late 90s with the unfortunate experiment in National Women's Hospital, where women were managed in a certain way that they weren't told about, and weren't told that there was an alternative. So we know that bad things can happen if these are not run properly with independent monitoring. So we have ethics committees set up around the country to basically monitor what the clinical trials are doing in New Zealand, to make sure that patient safety is being taken into account, and that everything is done to make sure the patients are safe. So remember, clinical trials are voluntary. You don't have to do them. We may say that one's available, but at the end of the day, you have to make a choice about whether you want to do that or not. And if you don't want to do it, it's absolutely fine. If you do want to do it, that's great. So they're voluntary. Even if you volunteer for a clinical trial, you can withdraw at any time you don't have to tell the doctors why you're withdrawing. We're obliged to ask you, but you don't have to tell us. So if you want to withdraw, you can withdraw. The doctors can also withdraw you from a trial if we don't think it's in your best interest to continue. So both patient and the treating doctor can actually take you out of a trial if we don't think this is the right thing for you once you're entered in the trial. Okay, so I think I've talked about those, the ethics committees. Okay, so when we decide to run a clinical trial in our centre, then we then have to present it to one of the regional ethics committees, and I think there's 4 in New Zealand, 2 in the north, 1 central and 1 southern. It doesn't actually matter which one you present it to, but it has to go through one of those, and we can't open a trial until the ethics committee have given a stamp of approval. And sometimes they'll ask us to change things within the trial protocol or change the wording on consent forms because they don't read quite right. So it's a good safety check. It's a pretty intimidating thing getting up in front of an ethics committee because they pull apart lots of different things. And sometimes there are some of them won't have that much medical training, but they're very astute people. So sometimes I go, well, why are you doing this? And I go, well, that's how we always manage those patients. So anyway, but that's a very good process because actually they're there for patient safety. So safety is paramount. Any concerns about how the patients are managed must be addressed to the ethics committee. The ethics committees also look at different types of clinical trials in slightly different ways. So when we run clinical trials, sometimes they're what are called physician-led trials, which means that a group of physicians have got together and worked out what they think is an important question to answer and then set up a trial accordingly. So most of those trials are usually with large international physician-led consortium. So in New Zealand, we have something called the ALLG, which is the Australasian Leukemia and Lymphoma Group Consortium. And it's Australian and New Zealand haematologists who run trials specific to leukemias and lymphomas. And so that's our group. But in New Zealand, historically, many of our acute leukemia trials we've run through the British research committees. So when I was a registrar, our AML trials, we actually adopted clinical trials based out of the UK. So we try and involve ourselves with these large consortiums. The good thing about these trials, they're not being driven by pharma. So they're questions that physicians think are really important. They're not being funded by pharma, so there's less chance for bias. And they're large groups of experts in the field, and that's a very important thing because it means if there are problems on the trials, you've got some of the best people in the world thinking about why has this happened and giving us advice as to what we should do about it. So it's a good way to run trials. Unfortunately, because there's no sponsorship for these, they also often run at a bit of a loss. So there are also pharma-driven trials which are run by drug companies, but they have to have independent monitoring as well. And those are looked at by the ethics committee in different ways. So say, for instance, a pharma-driven trial, anything that happens to a patient has to be paid by the drug company. In a large research consortium, which is physician-led, there's no money available for that, so it depends on the funding in that country. So in that sort of situation, most of the time the patients will be eligible to apply for ACC if there's a significant complication, but that's quite an important distinction. I was involved in an ALLG trial, well, we still are involved in an ALLG trial where it was run through the consortium, but the drug company supplied the drug for free, which isn't uncommon, but the ethics committee considered that to be a pharma trial, and we had to argue a long time to say all they've done is supply the drug. They're not involved in any of the intellectual property and the running of the trial. And eventually they changed their decision and said, okay, that's fine, which meant that luckily we haven't had any complications on the trial. But if there was, then those patients would have been eligible to apply for ACC. So that's quite an important distinction for the trials. So why should you guys participate? So one of the key things, it gives access to novel agents that may be of benefit in your condition. Now, Remember, we don't know whether they're going to be of benefit. That's why the trial is being done, but we think that it may be of benefit. So strategically in New Zealand, and Annette can vouch for this, we often are quite strategic in the trials that we run. Some of them will be consortium trials where we really need to know an answer about some things. Sometimes we'll be involved in trials to get our patients access to drugs they couldn't get through Pharmac. Now, some of those trials are industry trials looking at a slightly different drug that's already been proven to have an effect, or adding a new drug to something. And say, for instance, in myeloma, there's a number of new drugs out there. Many of these aren't funded in New Zealand, so our centre is involved in a clinical trial with one of these new drugs called a BITE antibody, a bispecific T-cell engaging antibody. Even the standard arm in that trial has drugs that we can't get in New Zealand. So we enrolled in this trial so our patients could get, it doesn't matter which arm they get in, because if they run out of treatment options, they're going to get something that they wouldn't be able to get through funded mechanisms. So it's a great trial for our patients because they then get another line of treatment they wouldn't be able to get otherwise. So we look at these strategically sometimes for those things. Sometimes it's because the scientific question that's being asked is really important, and it is the biggest question in a particular area. All data is anonymised, so the data can't be linked directly to you except through the centre you're at, where we will know the number that you've been assigned in that trial, but that can't be directly linked back to yourself otherwise. Some patients find clinical trials really reassuring because there's so many safety checks involved. They feel very safe and protected. Other people find it's incredibly intrusive, and if you're one of those people, sometimes trials are not the thing that you want because it can increase anxiety rather than decrease anxiety. So when you're thinking about a clinical trial, you have to think also about what's your psyche? How do you approach these things? Is this going to help you with your condition? Is it going to create more stress for you? Also, you need to think about practical aspects of this. If there are all these extra appointments, is this going to interfere with my life? If I'm trying to work full-time, is that going to interfere with me being able to work full-time? So you need to think about practical aspects of, the number of reviews that are happening, how often you need to be in hospital, and does that suit you or not? And that varies, and that might vary according to your stage of life, what's going on in the background. What are the potential downsides? Because there's always potential downsides. If you're in a randomised trial, you might get randomised to the standard arm. Now, if it's not a whole lot of new whiz-bang drugs, that might just be what you would have got if you hadn't been in the trial. But being in the trial is really important because it's testing a drug, even though you may not be on it, but that information will benefit someone else in the future. You might find you get on the trial drug, but actually it's no better than standard treatment, or it may not be as good as standard treatment, in which case then, okay, well, it hasn't been of benefit to you. So that's a potential downside. You might then be able to go onto the standard treatment later, but that is a downside. We're testing to see if this drug is better. We don't know whether it's better, otherwise we wouldn't be doing the trial. You might get unexpected side effects. Now remember, particularly those early phase trials, there's less known about the drugs in those early phase trials, so the risk is a bit higher in early phase trials compared to later phase trials. By the time you get to a phase 3 trial, we know a lot more about the drug. But you could be one of the unlucky ones who gets one of the bad side effects related to this drug, even if it's not a very common side effect. But I remember one of my colleagues saying to me, or saying to a patient, if you get a rare side effect, it might only happen in 1 in a million, but it's happened to you 100% of the time, so it doesn't matter how rare it is. So we know that people can get side effects on treatment, and that's one of the potential risks of a clinical trial. Why do we want our patients to participate? So it gives us access to cutting edge novel treatments that we wouldn't otherwise be able to get hold of for our patients. So we see they can be of benefit to our patients. As I said before, most of the haematology units in New Zealand actually are quite strategic in what trials they try to get up and running, because we want to try and improve access for our patients because there's unmet need. there's a potential for better outcomes. We know when we look at patients on clinical trials, overall, whether you're on the standard arm or the research arm, that patients actually do better on clinical trials than they do in standard of care. Now, there's maybe a number of reasons for that. One is that there's so many people looking at every little detail that it's a lot safer. The other thing, unfortunately, is that clinical trials are run to get an answer about a drug. Now, by that nature, sometimes people who have other medical conditions will be excluded from the trial because their other medical condition might confound the results, which means that in general, patients who get onto clinical trials often are fitter and healthier than the average person with that condition. So we know that can then bias the results and show that, in effect, or that everyone might do better on the trial because they're a better medically fitter group of patients, and that does sometimes clinical trials don't affect what the real world situation really is.
Does distance from where the clinical trial's taking place make any difference?
It can do depending on the trials. So sometimes it doesn't, but it can do if the drug's an oral drug, then that's one thing that's easier to run. If there's not a lot of visits, that's another thing that's easy to run. How much follow-up the trial demands also determines that. So some trials require very little follow-up, some require a lot of follow-up. So it depends on the trial itself. Now that is one of the problems we have in New Zealand, in that we have larger centres who can run more trials, but it's harder for our patients in smaller centres then to get to them, and the funding mechanisms around that aren't very good. Unfortunately, the New Zealand health system hasn't valued clinical trials as we consider its routine practice as part of our everyday work. Our health system doesn't recognise it like that. They think it's a nice to have, and which means that they don't always fund patients to travel to go on a clinical trial. Now, one of the advantages of pharma trials, we can just, most of the time we can just say to them, we've got this patient who lives X amount of things, you need to pay for their transport and their accommodation, and they do it. That's because they've got a lot of money. So that's one of the advantages of the pharma trials. It means that it's easier to get patients on trials because we don't have those barriers of distance. Yeah.
And Alwyn, surely this is something that we should be
Oh, hi Ruth, I didn't see you there.
So, I mean, at least now we've got clinical trials as part of the legislation of the new Health Act.
Yeah.
Which we didn't have with the DHB.
Yeah.
So that was a big step forward, and it's happened because people like you guys have been lobbying.
How long have you been working on that, Ruth? Decades.
We had a meeting with the top person for innovation and research yesterday, Robin Whitaker.
Yeah.
And certainly in terms of the rural trials, she's really keen on the model that ALLG have set up in Australia, and is keen to work with ALLG to bring that over here to New Zealand.
Oh, that's really good. That's really good. Nice to see you here too, by the way. Yeah, Annie?
Do you think that the new Te Whatu Ora will enable people to travel easier? If you know there's a trial in your particular disease in Auckland and you live in Dunedin, is that going to get easier?
Again, Robin indicated that she thought that it should happen.
It should.
Yeah, I know. But we've been saying that for years. It should happen.
She admits that it's early days. She's only just getting her team around her. But she's certainly, it was one of the things that she brought up with us rather than the other way around.
Certainly that's on the Cancer Agency's agenda as well. So, but we have always wanted that, but it's been very hard at the ground level to actually make that happen. Yeah, particularly with the DHB system where they're their own little empires. They don't want to pay for anything they don't have to pay for. They sometimes rorted money out of each other because that's how they kept their budgets going. And so there's a lot of inefficiencies with the way that was done. That's just my view on it, by the way, sorry. Yeah, allegedly.
I'm just going to bring...
But there is that sort of stuff, and I think with less things, that'll become a bit easier because if it's one organisation, there's then there's not as much cost shifting. Yeah.
I'll just bring the microphone in as well so we have this for our recording.
Do you work in like Osnum House in the cancer side where they have like in mid-central in Palmerston North they have 1, 2, 3 houses and
Yeah.
you come in there
Yeah.
and everything is there and
Yeah.
it's free.
Yeah.
Don't you work in something like that?
So I'm not sure whether Osmond House funded by the Cancer Society. Yeah, so we have something similar in Wellington, but it's got limited places available. Now, if you go to Margaret Stewart House, which is the equivalent of Osmond House, the DHB that are referring only have to pay a nominal $100 a night for patients. If there's no beds available in there, because we have a lot of out-of-region patients, they then have to stay in motel accommodation, and the patient ends up paying the difference because the DHB will only pay $100 a night. And so it depends on the demand for those places and what's available. Yeah.
Like Osnum House has 10 houses.
Yeah.
Plus they have 2 other sites and
Yeah.
they've got 6 houses on another one and 8 on the other.
Yeah.
And they're not always full.
That's lucky. That's very lucky.
And they come from everywhere,
Yeah.
not just in that region.
Yeah. I think also it depends on the size and what you're doing. So our hospital's a tertiary referral hospital, so we get patients from the mid-central region when they have specific treatments that we have to give them, but our mid-central colleagues don't do those particular treatments. And so we've got more patients from out of region trying to use those facilities, unfortunately. And it also depends on how the DHBs run. Some DHBs flex more than others for what they're willing to fund.
We don't have DHBs anymore, remember?
Yeah, still, I said in my last talk, I actually don't know what we're called anymore. So, yeah, no, but we're Te Whatu Ora, CCDH, Hutt Valley, Wairapa, I think. Yeah.
Do you mind? I'll just give you the microphone. So people listening online later on will be able to hear.
So going back in 2019, we still lived up in Wellington, and I was under Anoop George. And at that stage, he said I was a candidate for Dream 2, because
Right.
my numbers were climbing, and then lo and behold, my numbers just went bang. And it didn't make sense to go forward at that stage.
Yeah.
We now live down in Canterbury, and it's been great. And I, obviously miss Anoop, but Emma Jane McDonald's brilliant as well. But the one challenge we've got down here is we're not seeing any clinical trials in myeloma in the Canterbury region. Really? In myeloma?
So,
That's new, because I know when last year and this year there was the option of one of the private trials, which would have meant me travelling up to Auckland.
yeah.
So that's
So
obviously
I
new.
think that's probably a workforce pressure issue. So
Okay.
all of our department and the departments around the country have experienced extreme workforce pressure in the last few years, but actually probably for about the last 5 or 6 years, so before COVID and exacerbated by COVID. So in our department, we've had 2 SMO vacancies for about 2 years, which made it extremely difficult. We've just got our numbers back up. Canterbury have had that issue as well, and that's meant that in order to run the clinical trials, they may not have had the staffing. This is not just medical, this is nursing, this is allied health and everyone. So if you don't have we can't ethically get trials started if we don't think we can run the trials safely at the ground level. And so I think Canterbury have probably had that as I know they've had that as a pressure. Ruth, you can probably talk to that, but I know they've had that as a pressure. So that's probably just this point in time, as opposed to that's how it always is. In fact, Canterbury probably ran a lot more trials than anyone else for many years, actually, largely driven by the person behind you. So,
As I said, the conversations were last year when it just wasn't available.
yeah, but
So that's
that was very much, there was a number of
that's good.
unexpected events that happened that led to extreme force pressures. So getting back to this, why else do we like it? So clinical trials is how we learn how to use a drug. They're run in a certain way where we have to follow best medical practice, and we're trained in that, and it's drummed into us, and we have to keep on repeating it. So it raises the standards of care that we deliver to patients as well. So it's good for us as well as good for you guys for this. And as I said before, both clinicians and patients have the right to withdraw from a trial at any time. if we think it's in the best interests of you guys, or you guys think it's in your best interest, you've got the right to withdraw. How do clinical trials work? So this is, I guess, just running through how our department works. So a trial proposal will come through. It may come through from the ALLG. They have regular meetings, and we have some of our staff will attend those meetings and bring back a proposal about this is what's being offered in this particular condition. What do you guys think about this? Is this, we think this has got scientific validity, we think we can do this. So we run through a process in our department about, is this a good question to answer? Can we do this practically from a staffing point of view, from a facilities point of view, from a cost point of view? If we think that's all okay, we then, well actually first of all we do what's called an expression of interest, which is saying we think this looks like an interesting trial, but we don't know much about it. Then we have to answer questions to who's running the trial to see whether we might be a suitable site. Once we've done that, we start putting together practical issues around the trial. Then we also draw up a proposal and we present it to our wider research group in our department, which is the Blood and Cancer Centre department. They assess that and also decide against competing trials, is this the right way we want to reuse our resources? If that's rubber stamped, then it carries on. We have to then lodge a application with the Regional Ethics Committee and draw up all the paperwork, which can take some time. Then once all of that's gone through and it's approved, that's when the trial can get up and running. So it can take many months for that process. If a trial is only in its infancy and concept, it may be a concept that still doesn't get to having a trial protocol written for 12 months before it then comes to us to start to move this along. So sometimes it can take a long time to set up a clinical trial. If you've done a similar trial with a similar drug before, it's much easier because you've already worked out a lot of that stuff before. But if it's a new drug, then there's a lot more working out to do.
And are these trials like new trials completely, or have they already been done in other countries?
Yeah, so they're new trials, but sometimes they might be trying a drug in a similar class that we expect will have the same effect as the first drug, but we're not sure. So they can be a slight difference, but we sort of think we know what it's going to show. It doesn't always show that though, but that's so that they can be brand new, or they may be validating a new drug that's in the same class. Or sometimes a clinical trial will be done, but until we see a number of trials that say the same, doctors are skeptics. We don't believe it until we've seen it repeated a few times. Yeah. Right, so, does someone have, no, they didn't, okay. So in New Zealand we have something called the Leukemia Study Group, which meets twice a year, usually after the ALLG meetings have met, so we know what's happening in the ALLG, and that's where we discuss as a nationwide, all the haematology departments, what things we think we should try and go into collaboratively and pick out the merits of things, and it's sort of how we try and align ourselves with our colleagues around the country. We all have local research units. We've got one in Wellington and under the haematology team, which is part of the wider Blood and Cancer Centre research unit, which is then part of the wider hospital research unit. I think I've said all of those things actually, so I might move on there. What if I decide if I want to participate in a clinical trial? So if you decide you want to participate in the trial, usually the doctors or nurses might have already asked you, do you think this might be something that you would do, or we've recommended that we think you should consider it. Usually when we do that, we've already had a look at, do we think that you would fit into the what's called the eligibility criteria, and you don't have any of the exclusion criteria. So we've usually done a pre-check to think, okay, this trial looks right for this patient on the face of it. We'll then talk to the patient about the trial, and then if they're interested, we'll give them more information about the trial, which we then have generated documents that have gone through ethics to say, okay, this is what to expect on the trial. If you're still interested, then you have to go through a formal screening process to make sure that you do meet eligibility criteria. So that can be sometimes only a day or two. It can be over a number of weeks, depending on what tests have to be done. Now, sometimes in that screening process, we find unexpected things, which means then you can't enter on the trial, or something doesn't quite fit, and we need to ask either to see whether the central organising committee would make an exemption in a certain situation, or they might say, no, that's too risky to do. So just because you've been asked whether you want to participate in a trial, you still have to go through that screening process, make sure that all the eligibility criteria are met before then you can get onto the trial.
10 minutes.
Yep, okay, I think I'm almost done, I think. Actually, I think I'm only halfway through my slides, not sure how that happened. What if I decide I want to... actually, have I gone backwards there? All right, so one thing so we'll give you information on the trial. We need to have a discussion with you about what is known about the drug at the moment, what are the known potential side effects, but also knowing that that may not be a complete list. You don't have to know everything about the drug and everything about the trial, but you need to understand basic concepts about why it's being done and what are the potential risks in a general sort of way. You also need to know what are your other options. So what are your standard of care options? Do you have other treatments that might actually be more suitable for you at this time? So we talk you through both the trial and what your other options would be if you're not on trial. And then I talked about some of the practical things about the scheduling of the trial. Does the scheduling of appointments suit you? Is it all okay? Is it too cumbersome? So you need to take into account those practical things. So I've got a patient that I want to enrol in one of my myeloma trials, perfect candidate for it, but he's at a stage where he's working full time and he doesn't want to give that up, and that became the main issue for not going on the trial. Subsequently, that trial's still open and now he wants to go on it. So luckily, hopefully we'll be able to get him on that trial. So, things change for people as well. So we know that sometimes it may be not appropriate at one time, but it is later on. I think I've talked about that. So consent is a formalised process where we're asking whether you give consent to enter in the trial. Now, many years ago, I remember someone describing signing a consent form is not getting the patient to sign on the dotted line. A consent form is there for the doctors to remind themselves, have I told the patient everything they need to know to make a decision about this treatment? So that's how we should think about it, but it has to be a formalised process, particularly with a clinical trial. And as I said, you don't need to understand every last detail, but you need to understand the concepts and what you might expect. And then we do lots and lots and lots of paperwork after that, most of which is electronic now, but there's still a lot of form signing. One of the nice things about clinical trials, the patients we have on clinical trials, because we have so much involvement in it, we get to know you guys really well, you guys get to know us really well, and that actually just, patients find that really reassuring, knowing the staff in the day ward, knowing the staff on the ward, and it just decreases anxiety levels when they come in for treatments because you know everyone. You've got relationships with them, they're friends, and they're treating you. So that's one of the big positives about clinical trials. It can sometimes make a hospital a much less frightening place. What happens if there are problems? If there are known side effects, we may already know how to manage the side effects from previous trials. If it's a serious complication, you may be eligible for ACC. If it's a pharma trial, you may be eligible for the drug company to take care of mitigating that side effect. You can withdraw your consent at any time. I can't say that too many times. And I've said all that already, actually. So, summary. We can get better access to novel agents for our patients, which is one of the reasons why we like clinical trials. Clinical trials have been shown to improve patient outcomes with some caveats to that. The idea of clinical trials is that we're continually trying to improve patient care above what it is now, and so trying to continually lifting the bar so patients get better outcomes.
I've got a question.
What's that? Yeah.
How long do trials last?
It depends on the trial. So it depends on the effect you're looking for, because some effects we will know straight away. Some effects may take some years to be able to determine has that drug been of benefit or not. So it depends on the trial. Once you've been treated, there's an obligatory period of time which varies according to the trial as to how long you need to be followed up afterwards to see duration of response if it's a non-curable condition, but also to look out for longer term side effects or complications that might not have been well delineated in the early phase trials because they're mainly focusing on short-term things. So many trials will have between 2 and 5 years of follow-up afterwards, but as you get further out from treatment, the follow-up becomes less and less.
So if you went on a trial and your results were positive,
Yep.
Is there a point where the people who are organising the trial just decide that it's only going to run for that amount of time? What happens then?
So I think there's two parts in that. If you're just under observation after finishing treatment, that doesn't matter. There are some trials where you're getting a continuous treatment, and if the trial ends, the drug, if it's a pharma-sponsored trial, they're ethically obliged to offer you the treatment. Now, we have had problems at sometimes in the past where a drug company has not been willing to supply the drug, but that's very rare. Usually there's an understanding that if they're getting an effect, that they will continue to supply the drug. Now, if it's a consortium trial, and most of the times in those trials, they will only the drug will only be given for a certain period of time. But that is a potential risk, and one of the things that the ethics committees often drill down on is if this is a continuous drug, has the organisers given assurances that the drug will continue or not? Sometimes if there's a negative result to a trial, so for instance, the drug is not found to be effective or there's major complications, people will be taken off the trial drug because it's not as effective as standard treatment, in which case then it'll be stopped for those reasons. Yeah.
I've got the mic.
Yeah. Oh, hi.
We heard from David Downs last night about his fortune in participating in a trial in the US. How feasible is it to access offshore
Tricky.
trials?
It's tricky. So if it's offshore, most of the time it incurs a considerable cost to the patient. So you need to have the wherewithals to be able to do that for many things. Some trials will enrol you if you can get there and fund yourself to getting there and going through all the screening, and then they might pay for costs, but quite often it comes with a substantial cost. So I think when David went over to the States, he had to give a massive upfront fee to actually get on to the trial. And the... Oh, okay. Yep. A couple of trials in the UK that look very relevant. So that's one of the tricky things. The other tricky thing about going to another country, even though you might get access to another drug, you also have to consider your social circumstances, because then you're moving away from all your social supports, and that has some potential ramifications as well. Now, for some people that doesn't matter, but for other people it does. I've got a patient who was born in the UK and has run out of treatment options here, and he's considering going back to the UK, but he's actually decided he doesn't want to do that because he left the UK 30 years ago and his home and his family are here. So he's made a philosophical decision about that for those reasons, but it is quite tricky because the cost can be significant, particularly if you get really sick.
Got time for one more question, if anyone had one.
Oh, just one more thing on that note though. We can try and facilitate you going over there because they'll need a medical assessment. So if there was something, then your doctor can try and facilitate a referral to that thing. So you don't have to do it all yourself. And that'll then supply a lot of the medical information they need to decide before you spend any money, is it likely that you might be able to get on this? Yeah.
What happens with all the data is like all the data, you do a trial to get the data basically.
Yeah.
So the data would be public data. And I'm talking about the whole world, like all the clinical?
Yeah. So the data has to be kept safe, so it can't be obtained by anyone who's not supposed to get it. The data is anonymised as well, so from a confidentiality point of view, that's fine. When the paper is published, they'll publish all the statistics around the data, and sometimes the journal will want more information that will be supplied that may not necessarily be in the publication, but it has to be kept safe and confidential. Sometimes the ethics committees will actually ask you, where are you storing the data, and do you know it's safe?
So you'd have like a journal, something published in a journal, but there'd be more data as well.
Yeah, there is. So there's a whole massive amount of data that's collected behind a clinical trial. Has to be kept there's legislation around how long it has to be kept before it can be destroyed. Can't quite remember what that is. Might be something like 15 years. Yeah, 15 years, yeah. So it has to be kept for that amount of time.
So the data is like public information? So
no, it's not.
It's actually for
no, it's not
public good.
It's not
for
public
all our
information.
health?
No, it's not public information. It's kept by the people who run the trial. It may need to be made available to, say, an ethics committee or something like that, but it's not public information. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Alwyn, for your time today. We're very grateful for your knowledge and your expertise and your care of patients, and particularly grateful too that we know for all our haematologists and speakers today that time is precious. We're grateful for you joining us today, and thanks also to your family for sharing the weekend, allowing us to have you.
Thanks for Anouk George, who's doing my day on call today.
And to Anouk George. Just got a wee gift here for you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
So it's now time for a 10-minute break before we start our next sessions. Thank you all.